And the Westinghouse workers were represented by, had been represented by the United Electrical Union. But this union was under tremendous attack from the government because it was led by militants, many people who had been close to or were members of the Communist Party and had built that union. As a matter of fact, the UE today remains a union that is true to its history of struggle. You know the Chicago windows and doors workers who sat in last year? Well, they are in a local of the UE. And many of the organizing drives now underway in the South are affiliated to the UE. Our new young comrades in the Raleigh-Durham area work very closely with that union. But in the period when Dorothy was working at Westinghouse, all this government pressure on the UE led to a split. The UE was under tremendous attack, and a more right-wing union was formed with the initials, the IUE, the International United Electrical Workers. I was talking to Comrade Milt, who was also from Buffalo, who was reminding me that at that time Dottie had to make a very difficult decision because when this split happened, the workers in her plant voted to go with the IUE. And she either had to join the IUE or lose her relationship with her fellow workers. It was a hard decision that she had to do, but she reluctantly joined the IUE because she wanted to fight to represent those workers. She didn't want to be separated from them. She became a steward. She represented 1,000 workers in her plant. And eventually she was a member of the executive board of the union. But even in this more conservative union, Dottie was able to win a victory for all the women workers in this industry. Women made up half the workforce in Westinghouse. It was a big plant. But they were all in the lowest 3 labor grades. There were something like 10 labor grades, and the women were all concentrated in the 3 lowest labor grades. They were kept out of the skilled labor grades by the company. She applied for and won an upgrade to a level 7 job, a die maker, a die maker in the tool, what do you call it?
Tool and die.
Area. And this was a first in this industry, and it opened up the possibility for all the women workers to get better pay and better conditions. But of course, to have this victory, she had to win the support of her union sisters and brothers. And she was able to do that, to support her in this struggle. I myself worked in a couple of binderies in Buffalo around the same period. And I saw how segregated these plants were by sex. In one bindery where I worked, women worked on the folding and collating machines for $1 an hour, while all the printing jobs were filled by men who got $3 an hour. That was a lot of money in those days. I'm talking about the early 50s. The women were not unionized and were routinely humiliated and abused by the foreman, and I could tell you some terrible stories. In another bindery, I saw a different phenomenon. Again, we women got about $1 an hour. Most of us were quite young, but there were some older women there too. Very physically strong, and they wouldn't take any crap from the foreman. It turned out they were union workers on a temporary layoff from Westinghouse. They ordinarily got about $3 an hour, so they didn't care if they got fired for talking back to the boss. I said these jobs were segregated by sex, and they were. What about by race? There the segregation was total. The workers hired for even these miserable jobs were all white. Black women couldn't get manufacturing or clerical or sales jobs. They had to work as domestics for even less pay. Now Dottie, while she was working so hard that at one time, because she had several jobs, she almost had a breakdown. She was studying Marxism, and she was developing politically. younger comrades in our party who may not know her. They may know, however, of the pamphlet that she wrote called Feminism and Marxism, written in the early 1970s. There was a rising feminist movement then, and it was a great thing. But the leadership, and the leadership in many ways, you know, in that time was picked by the media. You know, the people who got the most publicity and all that. And so it was dominated by middle-class women with a lot of bourgeois ideology. And there was one woman named Kate Millett who had written a book called Sexual Politics. And Dottie, in her pamphlet, revived the ideas of Marx, and especially his collaborator Friedrich Engels, who wrote about the origin of the family and private property and the state, and showed how the patriarchal family had arisen, and bringing with it the subjugation of women in society. See, Kate Millett's view was, well, women had always been dominated by men. It was sort of like in our genes, you know, that this would happen. And she really, Kate Millett went out of her way to sort of dismiss any idea that there had been an earlier period in human history, which is a long history if you go back to before the books were written, when women actually played a very strong and leading role in society. But Engels had shown this, and at an early time when the anthropological evidence of this was just coming out, he had written his books on this. And since then, you know, this has been reinforced again and again, that yes, this is true, that early societies were communal, where women were not dependent on a male lover or a male husband for their livelihood. It was the community. Mm-hmm. The community was one of equals in that sense. And if a woman didn't like a man, she wasn't stuck with him, and he couldn't beat her up. He couldn't beat her up, and you know, and keep her as his property. No, she would just tell him, you know, take your stuff and go back to your family's gens or tribe. Go back to your parents' one. You know, you're not living here anymore. And Dottie was, you know, Dottie wrote this whole book. And the other thing about Millett was that what was her view of how women would be liberated through education and through nonviolent struggle. She pushed this, and she ignored the special oppression of women of color, who at that time were joining with their brothers in organizations like the Black Panthers and the Young Lords to fight racist oppression. Now, Dottie emphasized in this book that any alliance between white women and women of color had to first be based on the struggle against racism and national oppression. And that was something that was not on the radar of many white feminists at that time. She also contributed a great deal to the party's understanding of the oppression of lesbians and gays, and encouraged Bob McCubbin to write his groundbreaking book called The Gay Question, A Marxist Appraisal, which for the left in the United States was unique. It was the first time that a party calling itself Marxist took a position in the struggle for the end of lesbian and gay oppression. That was in the early 70s. I want to read you a quote from something that Dottie had said at a centennial meeting that was held on the anniversary of Karl Marx's death in the early 80s. She said, "Our struggle on the economic front must always be broadened to encompass all issues in opposition to the bourgeoisie: racism, oppression of women, lesbians and gays, and of course today we would add the transsexuals, transgender people, and queer people. The struggle for reproductive rights, for the aged, the young, and the disabled. Socialism is also a great cultural movement in every phase of life."